She doesn't understand the first thing about precision engineering. My father-in-law's voice carried through the partially open door of the executive boardroom. This is Montgomery Precision, not some arts and crafts project. I froze outside, the quarterly reports clutched to my chest, my knuckles white against the manila folder. I should have been used to William Montgomery's dismissals by now. After all, I'd endured 5 years of them since marrying his son David and joining the family business. My name is Olivia Reyes Montgomery, and at 34, I'd spent the last 5 years helping transform Montgomery Precision from a regional manufacturing company into one of the most innovative aerospace component suppliers in the industry. Not that William ever acknowledged my contributions. To him, I was the outsider who'd married his only son, the graphic designer who had no place in his world of machine tolerances and metal alloys. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The conversation in the room halted abruptly. William sat at the head of the conference table, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his tailored suit a shield of authority. David sat beside him, glancing up with a mixture of guilt and discomfort in his eyes. The other board members, mostly William's golfing buddies, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Olivia," William said, forcing a thin smile. "We're in the middle of a private discussion." "About me, it seems," I replied, keeping my voice steady as I approached the table. Since I'm the topic of conversation, I thought I might as well join in. William's jaw tightened. "This is a board matter. Your quarterly design report can wait." "My quarterly operations report," I corrected. "As Chief Operations Officer, I'm here to discuss our production efficiency improvements and the success of the new aerospace division, which has increased company revenue by 22% this quarter alone." I placed the folder on the table and met William's gaze directly. 5 years at Montgomery Precision had taught me that showing weakness around William Montgomery was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. "We'll review it later," William said dismissively. "The board is currently discussing leadership restructuring." "You mean my removal," I stated flatly. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. David cleared his throat but said nothing, his typical response whenever his father and I clashed. Always the peacekeeper, never the defender. William leaned forward, his patience visibly thinning. "Montgomery Precision has been a family business for 3 generations. The Montgomery name stands for excellence in engineering, real engineering, not the cosmetic changes you've been implementing." "Cosmetic?" I couldn't help but laugh. "The integrated quality control system I developed has reduced defects by 63%. The workflow restructuring saved us nearly $2 million in the first year alone. And the aerospace division you opposed so strongly, it now accounts for almost a third of our total revenue." Numbers on paper, William waved his hand dismissively. "This company was built on relationships and reputation, not flashy presentations and risky ventures. The aerospace contract with North Star wasn't risky. It was the opportunity we needed to move beyond regional manufacturing. The world is changing, William. Montgomery Precision needed to change with it." "That's enough." William's voice hardened. "This meeting is for board members only. As you're so fond of reminding us with your operations reports, you should be attending to the day-to-day running of the company, not interrupting board discussions." I glanced at David, waiting for him to speak up, to acknowledge that the leadership restructuring directly concerned his wife. But he just sat there, his eyes fixed on the table. "Fine," I said, gathering my reports. "When you're ready to discuss actual company performance rather than family politics, you know where to find me." As I walked out, I heard William continuing as if I'd never interrupted. "As I was saying, gentlemen, Montgomery Precision needs a return to traditional leadership." The door closed behind me, but his words had already planted a seed, one that had been germinating for months now. It was time to make a change. 3 hours later, I sat in my office, staring at the email I drafted to Alan Chen, CEO of Vertex Innovations, one of the most forward-thinking aerospace manufacturing firms in the country. We'd met at an industry conference 6 months ago, and he'd been consistently impressed with the innovations I'd implemented at Montgomery. So impressed, in fact, that he'd mentioned bringing me on as Vertex's new COO if I ever tired of family businesses. At the time, I'd laughed it off. Despite William's constant undermining, I believed in what I was building at Montgomery. I believed David would eventually step out of his father's shadow, and we would lead the company together into a new era. That belief had been growing increasingly fragile. I was still staring at the unsent email when David appeared in my doorway. His expression a familiar mix of apology and frustration. Liv, about the meeting. Don't, I cut him off. Just don't, David. We both know exactly what happened in there. What always happens. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Dad's from a different generation. He built this company with his hands. He just wants to protect its legacy. By pushing out the only person who's actually growing it, I shook my head. Your father isn't protecting anything. He's watching the industry evolve from the sidelines and refusing to join in. If Montgomery doesn't adapt, it dies. It's that simple. David ran a hand through his dark hair, a nervous habit he'd had since college when we'd first met. Back then, I found it endearing. Now it just reminded me of his inability to stand firm on anything. He's talking about bringing in Richard as interim COO, he finally admitted. Just temporarily, until things stabilize. Richard, William's nephew. The same Richard who had run his own father's manufacturing business into bankruptcy through sheer incompetence before William had rescued him with a meaningless VP title at Montgomery. I laughed, the sound hollow even to my own ears. Of course he is. And what did you say when your father suggested replacing your wife with his failure of a nephew? David's silence was answer enough. Right, I said quietly. You said nothing. What do you want me to do, Liv? He's my father. This is his company. It's our company, I countered. Yours and mine. We've poured everything into Montgomery for 5 years. I've worked 80-hour weeks to modernize production, secure the aerospace contracts, implement systems that will keep this company relevant for another generation. And your father wants to erase all of that because he can't stand that the ideas came from me. David sighed, dropping into the chair across from my desk. Give it some time. The quarterly numbers are strong. Even Dad can't argue with success. Once the North Star project is complete and we can show the full return on investment, he'll come around. I study my husband, truly seeing him for perhaps the first time in our marriage. David was brilliant in his own way, a gifted engineer with an eye for design that had revolutionized our product aesthetics. But he would never stand up to his father. Not for the company, and not for me. I can't do this anymore, I said finally. What do you mean? This, I gestured around us. Being constantly undermined. Having my expertise questioned. Walking on eggshells in a company where I'm one of the principal architects of its current success. I'm done, David. His face paled. You're not thinking of leaving Montgomery? I didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. You can't, he said, leaning forward. We're in the middle of the North Star expansion. The aerospace division is your baby. No one else understands it like you do. Apparently Richard will figure it out, I replied, my voice laced with bitterness. Liv, please. If you leave now, it will only prove Dad right. And there it was, the real concern. Not that Montgomery would suffer without me, but that William's low opinion of me would be validated. I think we're done here, I said, turning back to my computer. You should get back to the board meeting before your father sends a search party. After David left, I stared at the email to Alan Chen for another long moment before finally pressing send. Not a commitment, just an inquiry about the opportunity he'd mentioned. An escape hatch if I needed it. Little did I know how quickly I would. The next morning, I arrived at the office to find my security clearance revoked for the Aerospace Development Wing. When I called the security desk, they informed me that Mr. Montgomery has implemented new access protocols. No mention of which Mr. Montgomery, but I knew it wasn't David. By lunchtime, rumors were swirling that Richard would be taking over aerospace operations temporarily while I focused on core manufacturing processes. My assistant, Maya, delivered this news with wide eyes and barely concealed outrage. Everyone knows he doesn't know the first thing about aerospace, she fumed. The North Star team is already panicking. I maintained my composure, thanked her for the information, and closed my office door. Then I opened my laptop and responded to Alan Chen's enthusiastic reply to my email from the previous night. Let's meet, tomorrow if possible. By the end of the day, William had made it official. Richard would be overseeing the aerospace division effective immediately. I was being reassigned to oversee the traditional manufacturing operations, essentially a demotion disguised as a lateral move. David called from the airport, conveniently scheduled to visit a client site just as his father made this power play. It's just temporary, he insisted. Dad's just trying to show who's in charge. Once I'm back, we'll sort this out. There's nothing to sort out, I replied, my decision solidifying with every word. Your father has made his position clear, and so have you, by your absence. That's not fair, Liv. This client meeting has been planned for weeks. Life rarely arranges itself conveniently, David. Sometimes you have to choose what matters most. You matter most, he said, but the words rang hollow. We'll fix this when I get back, I promise. I didn't bother responding to the empty promise. We both knew he wouldn't stand up to William, not in any way that mattered. The next morning, I met Alan Chen for breakfast at a quiet restaurant 20 miles from Montgomery Precision. No need to fuel the rumor mill any further. I've been hoping you'd call, Alan said after we'd ordered. What finally changed your mind? I gave him the condensed version of recent events. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing increasingly incredulous. So they're sidelining the architect of their most profitable division because of family politics. He shook his head. Their loss, potentially our gain. I meant what I said at the conference. Vertex needs someone with your vision. I haven't made any decisions yet, I cautioned. I've invested 5 years in Montgomery. That's not easy to walk away from. Alan nodded thoughtfully. I understand. But let me be clear about what Vertex is offering. Complete autonomy over operations, a seat on the board from day one, and equity in the company. We value innovation and results, not family trees. It was everything Montgomery had never given me despite my contributions. Still, I hesitated. I need time to think. And to be honest, I need to understand what walking away would mean for the aerospace division I built at Montgomery. I won't leave my team hanging. I respect that, Alan said, but don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't stay open indefinitely. Back at Montgomery, I found Richard sitting in my office, feet propped on my desk, talking loudly on his phone about shaking things up in aerospace. He barely acknowledged me as I entered, finishing his call before lazily removing his feet from my desk. Olivia, he greeted me with false cheer, just getting acquainted with the aerospace operations. Quite a mess you've made of the documentation. Very confusing systems you've implemented. I smiled tightly. The systems that secured Montgomery's largest contract in its history and increased company valuation by 40%. Those confusing systems. Well, he shrugged, standing to leave. Sometimes the simplest approaches are best. William and I were discussing a return to basics, fewer bells and whistles, more solid engineering. The Montgomery way. As he sauntered out, I made my decision. I spent the rest of the day downloading copies of all my work. The project plans I'd developed, the quality control systems I'd designed, the client relationships I'd nurtured. All of it legally mine as the creator. All of it about to walk out the door with me. That evening, I drafted 2 letters, my resignation from Montgomery Precision, effective immediately, and my acceptance of Alan Chen's offer at Vertex Innovations. David called again that night, sounding tired after a day of client meetings. How are things going with Richard? He asked cautiously. About as well as you'd expect, I replied. He's planning to dismantle everything I've built in aerospace. Your father's thrilled, I'm sure. Dad just needs time to see that your ways work, David sighed. We knew it wouldn't be easy changing a company with so much history. No, David. I knew it wouldn't be easy. You thought your father would eventually recognize my value. He hasn't, and he won't. And you've never been willing to force the issue. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths. What are you saying, Liv? I'm saying I've accepted a position at Vertex Innovations. I start next week. The shock in his voice was almost comical. You're leaving? Just like that? What about us? That's up to you, David. I'm taking control of my career, something I should have done years ago instead of trying to earn your father's approval. You need to decide what matters more to you, your father's version of Montgomery or our marriage. That's not fair. You can't ask me to choose between my family and... I'm your family too, David. At least I thought I was. The next morning, I arrived early to clear out my office, expecting to have the floor to myself. Instead, I found William Montgomery waiting for me, sitting in my chair as if he owned it, which technically he did. I hear congratulations are in order, he said, his voice cold. Vertex Innovations. Very impressive. News traveled fast in our industry. I wasn't surprised he'd already heard. Thank you, I replied, placing my box on the desk and beginning to gather my personal items. I assume my resignation letter reached you as well. It did. Quite abrupt, don't you think? No notice period, no transition plan for your responsibilities. Not very professional. I met his gaze calmly, about as professional as being locked out of my own division and replaced by your nephew without consultation. I believe we're even on professional courtesy. William's jaw tightened. You signed non-compete and confidentiality agreements when you joined Montgomery. I trust you remember the terms. Perfectly, I nodded. No working for direct competitors within a 100-mile radius for 1 year after termination. Vertex's headquarters is in Phoenix, well outside that radius. As for confidentiality, I have no intention of sharing Montgomery's proprietary information. My value to Vertex lies in my skills and vision, not in trade secrets. You think you're very clever, William said, standing slowly. But you've made a critical mistake. David will never choose you over his birthright. Montgomery is in his blood. For the first time in our confrontational history, I felt a wave of pity for William Montgomery. He truly believed his company was the center of everyone's universe, that no one could possibly succeed without the Montgomery name behind them. Maybe you're right, I conceded. But I've made my choice, and now David will make his. Either way, I'll be fine. William scoffed. We'll see how fine you are when Vertex realizes you were just riding on Montgomery's reputation. You have no idea what it takes to succeed in this industry without a legacy behind you. I finished packing my box and picked it up, looking around the office one last time. That's where you're wrong, William. I've never had a legacy to fall back on. Everything I've achieved has been through my own merit, including transforming your stagnating company into a modern competitor. The question isn't whether I can succeed without Montgomery. It's whether Montgomery can succeed without me. I walked out with my head high, sensing William's glare boring into my back. 5 years of frustration and undervaluation were finally behind me. Whatever came next, whether David chose to support me or not, I was free. 6 months later, I stood in my corner office at Vertex Innovations, reviewing the final plans for our new aerospace navigation system. Under my leadership, Vertex had secured 3 major contracts that Montgomery had been pursuing, and our stock had risen 18%. My assistant knocked on the open door. The Montgomery representative is here for your meeting. I took a deep breath. Send them in. The door opened to reveal not the Montgomery sales team I'd expected, but David. He looked different, more confident somehow, his posture straight and decisive in a way I'd rarely seen when his father was in the picture. David, I said, surprised. I was expecting your aerospace sales director. We restructured the department, he replied. I'm handling key accounts personally now. I gestured for him to sit, maintaining a professional distance despite the personal undercurrents. We'd spoken sparingly over the past 6 months, our marriage suspended in a strange limbo while David figured things out. I'd given him space, focusing on building my new life at Vertex. Montgomery wants to propose a partnership on the Stellar project, David continued, pulling out a folder. We have manufacturing capabilities that would complement Vertex's design expertise. I raised an eyebrow. A partnership? That's unexpected. What does your father think of this proposal? David met my gaze steadily. My father no longer makes these decisions. He retired 3 months ago. Retired? I couldn't hide my shock. William Montgomery had always sworn he'd die at his desk rather than retire. After you left, everything you predicted happened. Richard nearly destroyed the aerospace division within weeks. The North Star contract was in jeopardy. Our stock dropped 20%. David's expression hardened. I had to make a choice. What did you do? I called an emergency board meeting and presented the consequences of my father's decisions. I showed them the true numbers, how your leadership had saved Montgomery from irrelevance, and how quickly we were falling without you. I gave them an ultimatum. Either my father and Richard stepped down from operational control, or I would leave and start my own company. I stared at him, barely recognizing this decisive man as the same person who had spent years avoiding conflict with his father. The board sided with me, David continued. Dad agreed to retire to a ceremonial chairman emeritus role. Richard was reassigned to a position more suited to his skills. Meaning? A small smile crossed David's face. He manages our booth at trade shows. Despite everything, I laughed. And now you're here proposing a partnership with the company that hired me away. I'm here because Montgomery needs Vertex's innovation, and Vertex could benefit from Montgomery's manufacturing infrastructure. He paused, and because I finally made the choice I should have made years ago. I chose you, Liv. I'm just hoping it's not too late. I considered him thoughtfully. The past 6 months had been transformative for me. At Vertex, I'd found the respect and recognition that had eluded me at Montgomery. I built a new life, one where my value wasn't constantly questioned. The partnership proposal has merit, I said finally. I'll review it with our team. And the other part, David asked quietly. That's more complicated, I admitted. I'm not the same person who left Montgomery. I'm not looking to be rescued or brought back into the fold. I'm not trying to rescue you, David said earnestly. I'm trying to earn back your respect. The partnership proposal isn't about bringing you back, it's about showing you that I've changed. That Montgomery has changed. I nodded slowly. I'll need time. Both for the proposal and everything else. I understand, he stood to leave. For what it's worth, you were right about everything. Montgomery wouldn't have survived without your innovations. My father was too proud to admit it, but I'm not. You literally saved our company, then we pushed you out. I'll never make that mistake again. After you left, I stood at my window overlooking the Phoenix skyline, thinking about legacy and value and the unexpected turns life takes. 6 months ago, I had been forced out of a company I helped transform. Now that same company wanted to partner with me, recognizing the worth they had previously dismissed. William Montgomery had been right about one thing. Montgomery was in David's blood. What he hadn't understood was that innovation and progress were in mine. Together, perhaps we could build something stronger than either legacy alone. But whatever happened with David, with Montgomery, with the potential partnership, I knew one truth with absolute certainty. I would never again allow anyone to make me feel small for being exactly who I was. An outsider who saw possibilities others missed, who built success through vision rather than inheritance. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving others wrong. It's proving yourself right.